witness a new dimension, which is, I think is a question of power. I mean, for me, Ayatollah Khomeini, in his put Shiism upside down. Shiism was about lamenting Karbala, lamenting the death of Hussein, and it was a religion of mourning to some extent, and Khomeini turned it into a religion of protest and religion of gaining power. What is the motto of IRGC? وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ. Gather whatever you can from power and from devices and from tools. So this is like, go and gain tool instead of sitting down and moaning about the evil of colonialism and being a post-colonial lecturer in a European university. Go and gain tool, go and make your missile, they kill you with airplanes, go and make your airplane. They are threatening to throw nuclear bomb on your head, go and learn how to make nuclear deterrence. That was the motto of revolution, and I think to some extent it has delivered. But still, people who are running Iranian military, and the reason Iran has not been invaded today, as we are talking, by Trump, and Trump is dwindling and hesitating, shall I start the war or not, is by those who actually who could manage to overcome the Russification. So, but it's an uneven and combined development. There are so many forces. Among them, there were the ones who went abroad, mainly to the Western universities. 98% of them, they went to Europe, to America, to Canada, to Australia. None of them went to China, Russia, or India. So they studied there, and their mind frame was developed there. Second problem, a big part of Iranian political energy of 1979 revolution got drained both during this post-revolutionary battle of hegemony, different factions fighting against each other, and second, and building states, institutions, it drained the revolutionary energy. And second, 8 years war. War it can produce many things and it can create many things, but also can drain your energy. So by the time that Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989, 3 or 4 things happened at the same time, which paved the path to Second Republic, if you want to call it. One, the absence or demise of charismatic leader. And Khomeini was an important element of revolution. Khomeini was not only the leader of revolution, he was, for a society like Iran, which is rooted in spiritualism or Irfan, his very person was that point of emulation and point of gathering of all his like political subjectivity. Second thing was, that was the end of war, and the promises of war, that we will go to Karbala, we will liberate Al-Quds, Jerusalem, etc. Suddenly people saw that, okay, we had 8 years of war, we didn't win, we didn't lose. And so it was an ambiguous ending to the war. But third thing, all this inside Iran coincided with a very important global event, and that was the destruction of Soviet Union. That was the collapse of Soviet Union and the birth of this unilateral super empire that we had never seen like of it before. And this superpower empire had its first show of power in Iran's region, in Persian Gulf. So what happened, in order to show the world that the world order and the logic of power has changed, it had to attack Iraq. And you remember better than me how those infrared images sent to CNN, which was the first cable showing for 24 hours, it almost like got etched to the consciousness of the global viewers around the world, including Iranian leaders. So Iranian leaders watched it with possible anxiety and fear, a country coming out of a devastating war without its charismatic leader, with a much weaker leadership of Khamenei and Rafsanjani together as a package after that, and seeing that there is no Cold War anymore in which we can maneuver in the interspace. And that's the important thing. So now we are the other of the empire. America said in 2002 that axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. But from 1990 onward, Iran, Libya, Syria, North Korea, these countries were the pockets outside the totalization of the empire. So from that moment, Iranians were quite scared. And I think a big part of this consciousness that we are talking about got shaped during that time. They thought we have to negotiate with the empire. We have to manage our problem with the empire, but we cannot overcome the empire. That's why we should not read history backward or retrospectively. It's easy today to say, why didn't Iranians go for building multipolar blocks? But in 1990s, there was no other bloc. There was only one thing on the horizon, and that was America. That was, I think, for me, to understand how this Western faction got shaped, you have to go to that very important seminal moment. But these two factions are fighting and fighting and fighting, coming to this moment. The other thing is, these people, I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, in the 80s, Iran had the fear and phobia of both camps. Fear of United States, but also fear of Soviet Union, because Tudeh party was very strong in Iran, and with all the positive things that Tudeh party has made for Iran, but Tudeh party, there are lots of documents of its loyalty to Moscow. There's an open debate. I have many of the two members of Tudeh as guests in my show. They will disagree with it, but at least that was understanding. And on the east side of Iran, there was occupation of Afghanistan by Soviet Union. And Iran had 2,000 kilometers at the time, direct border with Soviet Union. So the fear of Soviet was as strong, if not as strong as fear of America, but it itself was very important part of it. So, and I think that has continued as well to this preference of trying to at least establish your defense doctrine in an independent and in a self-reliant way. So that's I think as much as I can say from here. The second problem is, I think Iranian revolution, like many other revolutions in the world, it was really, even though it happened in Iran in the Islamic context, but it was also a child of its global time, global period, born out of 60s and 70s. It had tentacles in anti-Vietnam War. It had tentacles in Palestinian liberation movement. Many of the people who became prominent in Iranian revolution, like Chamran or even Ebrahim Yazdi, became foreign minister of the transitionary government after revolution. They had fought in Palestine or Lebanon. They had connections there. Yeah? Most of them were the students in the West, part of the Iranian Confederation, who were active in left movement here. You go to Badr Meinhof, you go to 1968 movement. 1968 started by the joint movement of Iranian students and German students. Yeah? And so that basically exploded Germany, and then that led to France later, and became Paris May 68. So in a sense, many of the elements of Iranian revolution were exposed to coming ideas, especially socialism, from their friends and comrades in the Western society. Also, a big part were like clergies in Iran, traditionalists who had never stepped out of Iran. But all these ideas merged into each other and they got hybrid. But in the 80s, I think Islamic Republic did a massive mistake, and it purged, massacred, and obliterated most of Iranian left. And so by 1988, it was left with only right-wing neoliberals who had come from abroad, from the Western universities, in a world unilateral, without any horizon outside. So they didn't even have right critique of Western capitalism and the new forms of it coming from 1990s onward. So in a sense, intellectually, Islamic Republic became quite drained and barren of any forms of ideas of resistance. And so they had to go deeper and deeper in their own Islamicization of revolutionary ideology. So there are two things. One is, I don't know how I mean, are we going like too much off the way from your main topic. But
no, very interesting.
Okay, if it's interesting, so let me explain. Because in a sense, if Ali Ahmed would be around, I think he would have written a second book saying that he talked about Westofication for a semi-colonized country like Iran, but you cannot de-Westoficate by issuing decrees, by making laws in parliament, by pushing a button, by order of the leader. You cannot de-Westoficate as easy as that. Westofication becomes itself part of the native geography of a society. So now we have, for example, native Westoficated, westernized Iranian intellectuals, which some of them are 150 years. I'm sure it's the same in Pakistan or like in India or like in Arab countries. Yeah? And you should understand them as well. You can, in an organic way, they can get affected and new forms come out of it, but you cannot purge Westoficated figures and you think everything's fine. Second, you cannot, I think Islamicization, to some extent, the very form of Islamicization itself was a Western idea. And, and that's why in many occasions you have immediate negation, using a Hegelian language, immediate negation of what the Western government of Shah had done before. So Shah, for example, in a very state-oriented Western style, which was alien to countries outside the Western world, ordered, how can I say, unveiling of all women.
Yes, right. Like that's the great example, is like enforced legal unveiling, and then you get in response to that forced legal veiling, right? So
exactly,
it's kind of polemical dialectic rather than really transcending and finding a different way of making it meaningful. It's just in reaction to the secularizing project. And you see it even in Turkey, similar. Maybe it's a little bit more balanced in that it was not enforced by the state, right? But again, like, you know, they're responding and reacting to what came before, perhaps in some ways, rather than figuring out some new direction, right, to naturalize it and get out of this kind of, because then that just creates the same reaction, is that they want to restore, right, you know, back to some so you end up being trapped a little bit in this response rather than forging something new.
Exactly. I'm just so that's why, in a sense, it might be easy for a normal audience who doesn't want to go too much inside Iran if you differentiate between Iranian Revolution, which was a massive historical force which inspired many people inside Iran and outside Iran and created political subjectivity and told them that, yes, you can. Don't worry about the West. Don't feel so inferior to the West. Ayatollah Khamenei's speech yesterday, which I covered last night, had many elements of that, because yesterday was the 49th anniversary of Ayatollah Khomeini's arrival in Iran, being welcomed by 3 million people. And in 10 days after that, revolution finds its victory. And Ayatollah Khamenei was saying that we had no confidence, national confidence. We didn't see ourselves capable of any creation, any invention, any innovation. And yet now we can do everything. And I agree with him. I think that was out of revolution. It taught people that you can make any technological thing you want. And I think that is there. But second problem is Islamic Republic of Iran. A state with all its contradictions, with all its like problems, unfolding endless contradictions. And so these two, you have to differentiate them. And I think the second one has its own kind of benefits, because in a sense, it was a native experience of state building with many contradictions and fallacies and problems. And you can see each one of these contradictions is unfolding and now getting faced by people and by the public in a very pricey way. The fact that the unveiling and veiling was not understood by a state, and the state used it for mobilizing its own forces and mobilizing them against part of the less Islamic forces or non-Islamic forces of revolution for the common benefit during 80s. Then in 2022 has this backlash and has such a price. You have to kill 400 people and you have to lose part of your legitimacy to back off and now there is no obligatory unveiling. So the state has completely backed off its learning. But when you look at, if you look from a more transhistorical point of view, these things are normal. I mean, any kind of long state, and even in kind of Western state, in Britain, in America, in France, they have gone through this when we were not around to witness as much as we are today in 17th, 18th, 19th century. A state building has its own contradictions. So we should not conflate a state building in Iran with all its problems, but nonetheless its own importance, because having a state in a region that imperialism wants to destroy all the states is very, very important. And we don't have the affordance to become anarchist like part of the left and say, let's do away with a state. A state has so many evils. We don't want them. We just want to go to a Rojava style, Kobani, no state, only people, communes. No, we cannot afford it. It's Middle East here, it's West Asia. And if you have a weak state, it takes about 3 days for America to come and bomb you. So you have this state with some evil, but many positive aspects. And then the other side, you have revolution, which is like a still is like producing and pushing people towards self-independence. I think I might have explained part of your question, but then the second one is about China and why Iran is not moving to China. So as I said, when you talk about Russia, you have to understand this long history between Iran and Russia. A third of Iran was taken away by Russian Tsar Empire in 19th century. Even Soviet Union during Stalin occupied part of Iran's Azerbaijan. And so there is this long suspicion about Russia. And also, this is not the same Russia that we see today. Russia, even up until 10, 12 years ago, was not trying to go head-to-head against the United States for the sake of Iran.
Right.
Things have
changed, obviously, with the Ukraine war and so on. That strategically they have, and in fact, actually, I would encourage listeners to go back and check out, and I put the link, Iran's history and geopolitical relations with Professor David Yagubian. We talked about the 19th century way in which there were these zones of interest and even agreements between the British and the Russians about which part of the country they would have predominant. So even though they didn't directly colonize, Iran has this history, and you pointed out also 2 periods of occupation around World War I and right after World War II. And so it does definitely have historic reasons to be suspicious of this aggressive neighbor that had, imperialist interests in Iran from before. But China is definitely is something of a different situation. There isn't that same historic animosity, enmity from longer history. There's, maybe the opportunities. That's why and also, of course, China is much more, powerful a country economically and in many respects right now. So that might be the question that people would say, why not, so please continue about the relationship between Iran and China.
So, but let me just finish Russia first. So in a sense, we have to look at with China as well. China today is willing to get a lot of American beating for sake of Iran. China is buying Iran's oil despite all America's threats. But China 10 years ago wouldn't behave this way. In 2009, 2010, 2 or 3 United Nations Security Council resolution were issued against Iran. And that was very paralyzing. This is the main reason for all these problems of sanction. And China and Russia didn't veto it. So in a sense, you have to remember, things are changing. Multipolarity is a new thing, is a new phenomenon. And Iran's problem and enmity, United States enmity and animosity against Iran is much older than that. So Iran has started defending itself when no one else was around. When America attacked this region and occupied both sides of Iran to squeeze Iran in 2001, Afghanistan, and 2003, United States, completely. Imagine 900 kilometers on one side with 905 kilometers and 1,300 kilometers on the other side suddenly became filled with American commandos and servicemen, and there was no one else to help Iran. So you can see Iran had to think from within, and that has some long-standing thing. But the second problem is Iran's domestic problem is finding echoes and counterparts in differences in foreign policy. So what does it mean? So from 1989, when Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the he was an absolute leader, because revolutions cannot have absolute leader, but he was a charismatic leader, powerful enough to be able to solve the endless differences and oppositions caused in a post-revolutionary state. This is like natural to any post-revolutionary state, that different factions are constantly fighting with each other. So even 1981, when they purged all the Marxists and all the Islamic Marxists, Mujahideen and things, but even the Khomeinis themselves had so much like differences of opinion among themselves. So someone looked from outside, and because of the Western media, Iran is a unified, homogeneous state with only one voice. And then you open the door and you hear this clamor of endless disagreement, fighting, backstabbing, and between different social factions, between political factions, even inside Khamenei's court, it's like endless. And I think to some extent is healthy to any polity. But it's like, for me, it's like the result of revolution, because you cannot absolutize the power. But when Khomeini died, that got exacerbated to a much higher level. And part of the polity, which was very close to Khomeini, the left-leaning faction of 1980s, they went abroad, mainly to United Kingdom. They became metamorphosized. They, what we call istihale, and they became updated, and they became third race, Anthony Giddens style, and they realized, oh, well, we need dialogue with the West, we need pluralism, we need tolerance, and we need to read some Karl Popper. Instead of reading some Islamicized version of Karl Marx, they moved to Karl Popper, and so you have this like burst of reformism. And so from that moment onward, national interest and national security has been taken hostage for the factional fighting inside the country. So even when so you imagine a character, I'm in opposition sitting outside, I constantly criticize you for criticizing Khamenei for why not having open dialogue with the United States. But when I get to government myself and I realize the real obstacles and constraints for doing that, I change my position. So in a sense, like United States, in Republicans and Democrats, when they're out of power, they behave differently. So domestic power and domestic endless infighting has translated itself so much on foreign politics. And the reformists and the pro-Western faction, more or less from 1997 onward, they formulated their politics in line with what was fashionable at time, which was democratization, civil society, joining WTO, and normalization of relationship with the West, and accepting part of the West's pressure in disarmament, and not kind of going any further in obtaining further kind of military technology. So they have not moved since then. They have not cognitively and epistemologically register the change of time. Let me just give you a famous example. Javad Zarif, who teaches international relations, is a very important figure, 8 years foreign minister, and then became Pezeshkian, current president's deputy. And he's like faced with this undeniable existence of multipolarity. When he was in power, he did everything for Iran not to join BRICS. He did everything for Iran not to ratify Shanghai Agreement and join Shanghai officially. And so, but when he's like faced with the undeniability of multipolarity, he said, it's not multipolarity. We have entered the era of non-polarity. So in a sense, to dodge the bullet and not to accept it. So they don't want to accept it, because if they accept it, they don't know how to push they lose their own political project. So historically, they have formulated the project in line with this move towards the West. I interviewed one of the famous Iranian reformists back in 2021, a lady, Dr. Elahe Kulai, who was an MP during the heyday of reform in 1999 to 2002. And she's a lecturer in Tehran University. And she famously said that if we move to Russia and China and to these autocratic states, we will lose our chance of becoming a democratic country forever. So they see this move emboldening, empowering the more autocratic faction inside Iranian states. And my answer to her was, why don't you move to China and Russia in order to open the shackle of sanction and basically save your economy from this strangulation, and with the money, then you can internally and domestically fight for democracy. I mean, didn't you always say democracy comes from a strong middle class back in 90s? You remember all those endless theories about middle class being this holy element pushing and driving the societies toward democracy? And she had no answer for that. So in a sense, I think maybe they are a bit too old for changing their policy, but also there's so much interest in that. In an irrational way, the interest of Iranian pro-Western bourgeoisie is, even if they earn money through doing business with the East is not a place for you to invest your money. They don't trust it. Who wants to save their money in bank in China when China have a good relationship with the hardliners inside Iran or with the state? You actually, if you want to plunder the state in the form of old colonialism and take money from periphery to center, you take it to the West. No, I don't know, Nigerian warlord takes his money to come to hide it in Russia or China. They take it to Switzerland. So in a sense, that's one of the main obstacles in Iran that people should understand, that the state has been too divided, and the strength of a state has been too deteriorated by this endless infighting. And you might ask me why the state doesn't do anything else. And the state did when the opportunity came. In 2005, the opportunity came. Ahmadinejad was not a normal conservative. He was a populist. He was an attractive populist who could manage to win the heart of millions of Iranians. He's done many mistakes. I'm not supporting him. I'm just describing what happened with when he came to power. So while normal conservatives are not very popular because they have a very statist language, Ahmadinejad was very different. He presented himself as an opposition to establishment. And so that really worked with the people. He got 18 million votes in 2005. And then he was lucky, or some people say he pushed for oil prices to go higher, especially because he became an ally with Hugo Chavez. And he brought a lot of money inside the country. He distributed widely from bottom. He gets criticized for not investing enough on infrastructure, but nonetheless, he made people very happy. And in 2009, I think all polls show that he had won that election in a landslide victory. They had done some small fraud here and there. There's no doubt about that. But I talked to many people, including Mir Hossein Mousavi's spokesperson in the West, Mr. Amir Arjomand, and none of them had any hard proof of systematic rigging that they claimed. And yet, what happened? The pro-Western faction created a mass movement, disputed the election, and brought the state to its knees. That's what you have to understand. Because Ahmadinejad had about they claim 24 million, 21, 22 million of votes. But from that part of society, which had less cultural, social, and economic capital. Whereas the part that Mir Hossein Mousavi and Rafsanjani had, They had a strong capital. They had strong roots in Tehran's bazaar, in mercantile capitalism. And also they had a relationship with the West. So there is a hard document of Rafsanjani's son asking people in the West for lobbying for sanctions, because they thought Khamenei's hard-headedness, not negotiating with the West, all these things, and also purging us from the state is dangerous. So bringing power from the West in order to push your rivals domestically. This has been the dynamic inside Iran. And this is the main problem. And Khamenei couldn't win that battle. So what he did, he compromised. 4 years later, he invited them back into election, and he shared the power. He gave them the executive branch, and he allowed them to go and negotiate. And the result of that was Hassan Rouhani. So you see Hassan Rouhani as a president, Khamenei as the leader. Khamenei talked today, on today's Monday, he said, we will not budge to America. Hassan Rouhani will give a speech on Tuesday next day saying that those who don't want to budge to America are blind to people's poverty. So in a sense, that is a kind of friction inside the country. So now, with that image, I hope that people have understood that why Iran cannot act in a very unified, straight way sometimes. Many people ask me why Iran didn't join the battle why didn't join in solidarity with Palestinians right after 7th of October. And many people inside Iran believe that from realist point of view, the reason that we are here today, the reason that the United States and Israel can dare to wage a hybrid warfare on the streets of Iran and force the state to kill thousands of its own citizens is because Iran didn't join, because Iran got weaker and weaker. And why didn't Iran join on 7th of October? Because of the internal political situation. Many people ask why Iran didn't dare to announce that Raisi's helicopter crash was assassination done by Israel. Again, for the internal problem. Mm-hmm. Go on.
Well, no, also the same kind of question people argue about, why not announce, real deterrence with a nuclear weapon, right? And then very often this is described as a theological kind of question. And of course, there's some component of that. I mean, we should acknowledge that that's part of the religious rulings and so on. But clearly, and I even heard, I think it was Dr. Ali Alizadeh on some program not too long ago, where he said, yes, well, of course, this is the doctrine, but, as circumstances change, these things will always be applied according to circumstance, right? There's always interpretive room, in these things. So really, it isn't just a question of, like the Orientalists and people who fetishize, Islamic ideology, always kind of, explain it as, well, okay, there's this religious ruling, so they can't, do that. That's not the real geostrategic and political thinking behind it. It fits into the pattern that you're mentioning, is that there are these kind of divided factional kind of forces that have to be managed, and it produces its own contradictions in approach and policy.
So Iran is getting constantly criticized for not being democratic and having a dictator on top. But the reality is actually, I'm not saying it has too much democracy, because it's more like plutocracy. And for me, democracy is not there until you have trade unions, you have like the right of assembly and many other things, and actual people without economic power being able to come to the political arena. However, but you have too much of this, this kind of semi-democracy in Iran, which is to be managed. And I think that's what people should understand, that it is a post-revolutionary situation. It's not something that Khamenei can go and arrest every critique, bring tanks to the streets, and solve the problem. So Iran is not even like Chinese Communist Party of 1989, which can do a Tiananmen. So it does a semi-Tiananmen and immediately has to back off and then make amends and make kind of a deal with the other side. But let me just give you an example again for people to understand. Let's go back to 2009 election in Iran. the first one of these big movements, which brought really, truly millions. Tehran had 2.5, 3 million people demonstration on, if I'm not wrong, on 5th of July 2009. But what happened there? Ahmadinejad's forces were shouting, nuclear power is our inalienable right. And pro-Musavi forces were shouting, neither Gaza nor Lebanon, Iran only and Iran. So you could see how these forces were echoing different foreign policy slogans. And you could see how the battle over foreign policy has become central to the domestic battle in Iran. And so what would you do as Washington? You would constantly try to empower the pro-Western faction. You would give echo to them. When they are winning the election, you say, hope for Iran, reform, possibility of reform, change. And when the other faction, which is like the realists, are winning and are emphasizing independence, the West portray them as crazy, cannibalist, hardline, super Islamist fundamentalists. Whereas I think to some extent Ahmadinejad was even culturally much more moderate than Hassan Rouhani and governments after him. So in a sense, you have the power of the West coming to your aid as well and creating this discourse on behalf of reformists, which then gets consumed by people inside Iran. So a young person in Iran is consuming both BBC Persian service, which is created by British government in order to help and aid reformists in Iran more than anything else. And also gets like CNN and also gets like celebrities in Hollywood who all come to help this reformist discourse. And so being ghettoized in a country under sanction, not being able to travel abroad much, feeling isolated enough, suddenly you hear Angelina Jolie or Angela Davis, doesn't matter, from Angelina Jolie to Angela Davis, all of them say yes to your movement, go for freedom, we are with you, we are in solidarity with you. You feel very empowered. That's why their political energy doesn't come from revolution and from the internal history anymore. Directly gets like imported from the West, and that makes it even more complicated. So I hope that I've explained part of your
that's
questions.
very, very useful analysis. And I'm sure very illuminating for the audience, because you don't usually get such a kind of rich sense of what is being contested in Iran, and particularly its relationship to the foreign policy question, which makes me wonder, if, that's been a historic pattern. I'm wondering if you would say that things have changed. I mean, it seems like we might not be any longer in the era of strategic patience, given the more kind of defiant sorts of statements of warning, the United States, that any, attack won't fall into the earlier pattern of, we'll kind of arrange a kind of theatrical kind of, you bomb this, we bomb that, and then we call the case closed for the moment, and we buy one another more time, and we back off of the difficult kind of confrontational rhetoric by doing that. And we see that, in this pattern. I mean, that it's happened many times. But what about has anything changed from your perspective in the relations between these kinds of forces? Is there a new consciousness or new forces that have aligned or emerged as a result of, say, the 12-day war? Because it seems that was a moment where all factions from within society and different classes and different cultural orientations could basically come together on the basis of Iranian nationalism and sovereignty and defense of the homeland in response to grotesque, brutal, imperialist attack from Israel, and with the connivance, as it's increasingly become clear, and knowledge and connivance of the United States, and then culminating in spectacular U.S. bombing in order to bring to a close, and relieve perhaps Israel from the damage that it was taking in the Islamic Republic's response once it recovered from these initial attacks. But what we saw after that was that there were lots of expressions of, kind of collective Iranian nationhood. And yet, some 6 months later, you have these economic grievance protests being quickly turned into much more kind of violent riots against the regime that lead to almost nihilistic kind of, violence, attacking public infrastructure, buses, hospitals, clinics, shooting of police, burning, mosques, and so on. And using Starlink, thousands of Starlink terminals to, kind of communicate and so on. That seems like, it represents that there were certain, we can say, of course, that these were very much inspired, organized, maybe arms were brought in and so on by various, external groups using some of their, kind of dissident groups seeking autonomy or independence, like, Baluchis in certain part of the country, Kurds in the north, and MEK terrorists, etc. But there was also clearly some internal, groupings, maybe among the youth, etc., that were willing to be committed to use violence against what you might say is the public, just the society as a whole, in order to try and overthrow or undermine the government. So how does one kind of explain and see, how this could happen, and what are your conclusions?
Okay, I think the kind of logical problem here is you see Iranian people as what you see in TV, and you think, oh, well, 6 months ago they were rallying around the flag, what the same people are doing. It's not. It's a country of 90 million people with endless factions and different layers. And I think we saw a big part of Iranian society rallied around the flag, and not necessarily around the Islamic Republic, but around the cause of nationalism back in June and July 2025. However, here we are seeing a small faction. I mean, opposition say up to the same million, but state says 200,000 or 300,000 people came outside all together in hundreds of cities. So it's a small faction. None of this image we've seen is determining the Iranian people as a whole. So I think that's one thing. But one thing we know is, like, the Iranian people as a whole are not happy. This is like a direct message that we have from elections, which is not only one election, 3 consecutive elections, 4 consecutive elections. 2020, yes, March 2020 parliamentary election. Then you have presidential election of 2021, and then you have the parliamentary election of 2023 or 24, and then you have the presidential election of Pezeshkian. And you have, while you used to have 60, 70, or 77% participation previously, now it has gone to 50%, 40% participation in presidential election, and Tehran parliamentary election has come to 8, 9%. So the message is clear. People are not very happy with the way economy is being managed, with the fact that Iranian government has not managed to overcome sanctions, number one, and second, the fact that despite the sanctions, there is a massive class difference, and it's a question of injustice inside the country as well. And then also the question of rentierism and the question of nepotism and the kleptocracy and all these things. So if any anti-imperialist tells you that Iranian people love Iranian state, I think they should come and live in Iran. Because no, I mean, if you have like 14 years of consecutive sanction in which there is no horizon to get out of it. People can, across the world, whether it's like in Canada where you live, or Britain where I live, or in Iran, people can deal with poverty as long as there is some horizon of change, economic change in the future. So, but then the state at the moment is in trouble giving any image of possible exit from this economic dire situation. And I think they've lost their way of making narrative. That's why I argued that if Iran goes to a war, to an all-out war, might be better for it to manage the situation rather than wait back again, impose more patience, and then internally and domestically gets deteriorated and exhausted and other things. Second is, back in 2020, when I started my channel, there were people who were talking about the necessity of a Bonapartism in a style of kind of what Marx talks about, that the suspension of republic for a couple of years for a strong force to come and manage to sort the problems. And Ibrahim Raisi was seen as a kind of Bonapartist government, and he didn't manage to do so, or at least the other side used the opportunity of woman life freedom and those cultural riots to disable and paralyze Raisi's government. So, but nonetheless, Raisi was offering some meager light at the end of tunnel. So he was giving some light by joining BRICS, joining Shanghai, and maybe he could bring some kind of foreign investment from BRICS countries. And then after woman life freedom, things became very difficult for him, and internally he couldn't do much. So and also even his government was very close to oligarchy, and he couldn't stand against them. So all these things are together. But are Iranian people angry enough to allow regime change from above by America bombarding Iran? I think that's a media hype. That's a media hype, and I don't think, based on all the statistics that we have from Iran, because Iran, like any other society, is not that erratic. You have lots of polls. These polls are all available. I'm absolutely like in disbelief why, when it comes to Iran, the Western media are acting the way that Orientalists acted in 17th, not even 18th, 17th century, mystify and go to like this like propaganda. It's like a society, mate. Just go and read one of these polls. There are so many sociologists in Iran. There are like 125 department of sociology and thousands of sociologists, thousands of like social science experts. Go and talk to one of them, bring them to come to your program, use a translator. They will explain to you how many Iranians are religious, how many are less religious, how many are anti-religious, like every other society. You have like, I think 2 million people in Britain voted for Jedaal, Jedaal, the Star Wars character. Yeah? Was it whether it was a joke or was it a trend or they really believed? So if I come and build all my analysis of British society based on that, that makes me either a propagandist or a stupid, idiotic person. So when it comes to Iran as well, it's always like optic being seen from the media. This doesn't work. Yeah? Iranian society has a strong religious core, but also the trend of secularization is very strong. So the contradiction is strong. What you've seen by burning mosques, it can be organic, but it's definitely pushed and pumped by other people. Even if you are atheistic, Islamophobic, and yearning to return to pre-Islamic Iran with this like semi-racial supremacy of Aryan discourse that the Pahlavis use, you wouldn't go and dare to burn mosque because you know the consequences, not from the state, the consequence of ordinary Iranians. Yes. The same way that no one would dare to go and burn a church in Britain because the consequence of ordinary British passerbys to stand against you. So I think that was pumped and thing, but nonetheless, there is a hatred of Islam by a small faction of especially young generation. So these things can be organic, but still there's a core into Iranian society, and this core has acted rationally, doesn't want foreign intervention, but is tired of corruption, is tired of economic injustice, and is tired of the state's mismanagement and inability to deal with the sanctions. Also, this core, this the rational core, was the one which went along with Hassan Rouhani's promise of resolving Iran's fundamental problems by sitting on negotiation with John Kerry for 2 consecutive years and making massive compromises, and has historically experienced the fact that America does not abide by its own promises and obligations. So they don't have that much hope in that either. So in a sense, you have this, that's why Iranian society is more or less depressed, doesn't see much option out. And I think is the other side, the revolutionaries, realists, whatever, the other faction is to be blamed, because they should have created a narrative for turning to multipolarity. They should have explained that there were other countries who were doing worse than us. They were under even more pressure than from the United States than us, and they managed to resolve it not on their own in an autocratic way, but by building blocks with other southern countries. And the fact that Iranian national TV, IRIB, doesn't have enough programs. Only last week, for the first time, apparently they started having a kind of mini documentary series about China and Chinese cities and what it means. Because many people in Iran still have an image of China as it was in 1980, in which bicycles are going and coming. And Iranian pro-Western politicians famously, including Masoud Pezeshkian, in his electoral debate last year, they talk about why should we have, he talked about China as 2 things. One, buying our oil underpriced and selling us rubbish, low quality rubbish. This is like unbelievable. I mean, this is like your image in 1995, like 2020, 2002, not in 2025, 26, which is like, is a beacon of like high tech and cutting edge technology. So in a sense, the country is a bit stuck. The leader is a bit old. The narrative is neither peace nor war. So if we move a meter away from the media hype and all this noise, no, Iran is not going to be destroyed by America. But whether Iran can find a path forward is much, much, much more difficult question.
Ali, I really have to thank you for giving us this really well-developed and thorough perspective on, the conundrums that Iran faces. It brings so much beyond the simple stereotypes and propagandistic portraits of Iran, and brings a lot of illumination. I wish we had you've been so generous with your time, and I know you're so busy. I would have loved to have talked a little bit more about the diaspora and some of these factions and what role they're sort of playing in helping perpetuate imperialist and Zionist views about Iran, perhaps for another time, but also even our friends, as Professor Gerald Horne often talks about our friends on the left, when he means to say something somewhat critical of their, discourses, is that even there's been a real gap when it comes to, showing solidarity and really examining and understanding the circumstances in the rich textured way you've given us through history, politics, economic and geopolitical analysis. But we find that a lot of people who should be in solidarity against a war and an attack on Iran, and for lifting the sanctions, let's remember, that people have not been talking about 40 years of sanctions, and especially a decade really of these maximum pressure sanctions. That there should be more solidarity. And instead of having protests to say hands off Iran, like we have for hands off Cuba, hands off Venezuela, no war on Iran. Instead, I've read articles today about supposedly 100,000 protesters filling the streets of Toronto to support the people of Iran against their regime, and to call upon the Canadian government to support and do more. So not to be there against a war on Iran, but in fact actually playing into these narratives. Yeah, for war, ultimately. So there's so much we'll be watching. I encourage everyone to go to Jedaal channel on YouTube. There's a Jedaal English as well. If you don't speak Farsi, like most of my audience, although there are some people clearly, who do, they should be watching Jedaal TV. Also, you have on Jedaal English some excellent documentaries that I want to recommend that people check out. You did one almost a year ago on the untold story of Hezbollah, which I think is still extremely important and relevant, in thinking about the rise of that movement and, what its sources are, socially and ideologically and so on. And you also did one of just a few months ago about Iran's nuclear program, the history of Iran's nuclear program, again, in this sort of series, The Untold History. So I have to thank you for those very, valuable contributions and encourage people to go check those out and to check out your channel. Where else can people follow you and keep track of what's happening as we continue to observe the situation that is, not resolved? We're still going to be seized with this. Where should people go to get up-to-date analysis and information from you?
They can follow me on Twitter, is Alizadeh, but instead of Z, they have to put 7, which looks like Z. And also, given you mentioned those documentaries, I think it would be interesting for people to see, because in line with everything I said today, my aim was to explain that Iran is not an essential thing there, that someone can come and talk about it. This is a country coming out of a very long history, but also the current phase is created out of a massive revolution, and revolution creates processes. So we are talking about processes, and these processes intersect. They cut each other off, they negate each other, they oppose each other, they get kind of united together. So in a sense, is a country in which things are still becoming and constantly are becoming. People are changing. So when the revolution started, most of Iranian society was rural. Revolution helped urbanization of people. Revolution helped most of these rural religious people come into city, send them to university, to a school, and in a sense inadvertently created process of secularization, different demands. So it's a burning society with many things, but studying and understanding this extremely complicated, constantly changing, ever-changing society and state is one thing. The Western propaganda, which mystifies and demonize and give you a one-sided story of baddies and these like bad wolves of a state and this poor nation which is like shouting for help from the white saviors, is another thing. So you can be critique of Iranian this or that element of Iranian state, but which part? Because there's so many factions that right now, as I'm talking to you, there are factions in Iran who are asking for eradication of all neoliberal policies. There are other factions who are asking for full immersion and co-option inside Western global market. There are the other factions. So in a sense, my proposal to people is look at a country with 90 million population and history of so much internal change with a bit more respect, rather than in a usual colonial way try to simplify and objectify it and demonize it from outside. So if you look that way, I think things become a bit different. Those documentaries I made were actually representation of some of these processes. For example, when it comes to military, you have to see how it is rooted in the political energy coming out of revolution, how this belief that we have to defend ourselves rooted in revolution and the war. And so people can see how Iranian missile industry, drone industry, and nuclear industry were produced out of desperation, but also out of question of sovereignty. And I think despite what we saw in the last few weeks, that the West has so much vengeance, so much hatred against Iran's sovereignty. I mean, the problem is nothing to do with like the current protests. The problem is coming from 1979. United States still has not forgiven the fact that a nation in West Asia had dared to ask for its sovereignty, had dared to say, I don't want to be a slave anymore. I want to decide my own situation. And if I'm allowed to say this one, this is important as well, because that's one story in which one can really side with Iranian state. Iranian state is not a superhero who comes and join 7th of October, resolve all the kind of contradictions inside, fight against its internal oligarchy, fight against its corruption. It's not a superhero. But when you look from the other side, that it has managed to survive against 49 years of endless enmity from the United States, and it still is here. Its very fact of survival is near miracle. And I think that's something that if you look from the other side, you can have some respect and some solidarity with the state. Yeah. So depends where you're coming from. I, as an Iranian, and I see myself as a subject of Iranian revolution, have my own criticism internally, but looking from outside, the fact that we saw only in the last 3 weeks, every single member of European Union, every single member of these Arab monarchies, so much hatred, as if all of them want to undo the history. Their hatred is hatred of 79 revolution. And in that sense, one should stand with the state as the harbinger and the inheritor of the revolution, with many perversions, of course, with many fallacies, perversions, and contradictions. But nonetheless, because of revolution, you have to understand which side you are siding with imperialism to destroy it, or with the revolution.
I completely second that, and just would remind people that although we always talk about modern history of Iran, this is a society and a culture and a civilization that has 2,000-3,000 years of history of statecraft, of having a state. It's not to be dismissed lightly. And when you talk about the revolution, I've heard you say elsewhere that it was maybe one of the fourth most important, or certainly it was the fourth in a line of very serious revolutions of global historical significance. I would actually say 5. I assumed you were counting the US revolution, which I would say debatable, but okay, it's had a kind of impact on political discourse globally. The French Revolution, of course, the Haitian Revolution, I think must be included in there. Then, of course, there's the Russian Revolution, and then you have to put the Iranian Revolution. I think you make the case that we all have to learn this history. And in doing so, reorienting our sense of historical narratives will also reorient our sense of politics, and do so with greater respect by learning about, the important sacrifices that the people of Iran made to try and free themselves, and the imperialist forces that are aligned to try and undo that. So again, I want to thank you so much, Ali, for a wonderful conversation. I'm sure people learned a lot, and good luck with all of your continuing ventures to try and educate people. Everyone should go follow you on Twitter, on x.com, Ali Alizadeh with a 7 for the Z, and also follow the channel Jedaal TV. It's also in English. Again, thank you so much. And to everybody else, please like the stream. Share it with people. More people need to learn and hear about these kinds of analyses and historical contextualization. Until next time. And also, I want to mention that I have an upcoming stream in an hour and a half. It's a big day for Iran streaming. I have a former student, PhD student of mine, Milad Dokhanchi, who will have probably, I think, a more anarchist sort of take. I mean, he's in Iran, and he's got his own political take, but it's good to hear from people who are inside Iran, who they may have their own critiques of the state, but also have a view on the society, and want to communicate how and why they should be left alone to be able to follow their own sovereign path of development. So we'll be talking at 2 p.m. Eastern with Milad Dokhanchi. Hopefully the internet, will work, and we'll have a second component of the live stream today, special edition of Office Hours Inside Iran with Milad Dokhanchi. So I invite you all to rejoin. And until that next time, peace and solidarity. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.